History is a chaotic, overlapping mess of what the hell moments that make you question if the simulation is glitching or if a bored time traveler is actively messing with the settings. We like to compartmentalize eras. We put the samurai in one box and the fax machine in another, but the universe doesn't care about our boxes. This is an investigation into the 10 most jarring, painfully true historical overlaps that sound like pure fiction. If you don't find yourself staring at a wall for 10 minutes after this, questioning your own existence, then you weren't paying attention. Let's break the timeline. Number 1. The Samurai Fax. Feudalism meets the telegraph. Imagine a world where a warrior in full plate armor, wielding a master-crafted katana, could have walked into a wooden office and sent a digital document across the ocean. This isn't a steampunk novel, it's 1843. While the American West was still a wild expanse and the light bulb was decades away, a Scottish inventor named Alexander Bain patented the electric printing telegraph. This was the birth of the fax machine. It used a clock-synchronized system to scan images and reproduce them over wires. It was primitive, it was slow, and it was revolutionary. But what's truly unhinged is what was happening on the other side of the planet. In Japan, the samurai class, the elite warrior caste that had dominated Japanese society for 7 centuries, was still the law of the land. The shogun ruled with an iron fist, and the concept of modernity was a distant whisper. The samurai weren't officially abolished until the Meiji Restoration in 1868. This means there was a 25-year window where a samurai, wearing his traditional topknot and carrying the soul of his ancestors in his blade, could have theoretically sent a fax to Abraham Lincoln. The visual of Honest Abe receiving a digital trade agreement from a shogun is a historical reality that feels like a glitch. We think of the samurai as medieval relics, but they lived in the era of early telecommunications. The fax machine is older than the end of feudalism in Japan. Let that sink in the next time your office printer jams. Number 2. The chainsaw's dark origin, medicine's most terrifying tool. If you see a chainsaw today, you think of lumberjacks, horror movies, or DIY projects. You do not think of a maternity ward. But in the 1780s, the chainsaw was invented by 2 Scottish doctors, John Aitken and James Jeffrey, specifically to help with childbirth. Before the modern C-section was perfected, which was usually fatal back then, doctors performed a procedure called a symphysiotomy. If a baby was stuck in the birth canal, the doctor's only option was to manually cut through the mother's pelvic bone and cartilage to widen the exit. Originally, they used a small knife, which was slow, agonizing, and often failed. The solution? A hand-cranked, rotating chain with serrated teeth. There was no anesthesia, there were no antibiotics, there was only a doctor frantically cranking a small, bloody chain through bone while the mother was fully conscious. It was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering used for a purpose that sounds like a nightmare. It wasn't until the late 19th century that people realized this terrifying bone cutter was actually much better at chewing through oak and pine. Humanity has a consistent, bizarre habit of creating instruments of pure terror and only finding reasonable uses for them after the trauma has set in. Number 3. The Last Blade, Star Wars and the Guillotine. 1977 is a year that lives in the cultural zeitgeist as the birth of the modern blockbuster. Star Wars: A New Hope premiered, changing the face of technology, special effects, and science fiction forever. We were looking at the stars, dreaming of lightsabers and hyperdrive. But on September 10, 1977, in a prison in Marseille, France, the state was still using an 18th-century execution device designed during the French Revolution. The guillotine, the national razor, was used to execute Hamida Djandoubi. While kids in America were playing with plastic X-Wing toys, a real human being was having his head separated from his body by a machine that was considered a relic when Napoleon was alive. France didn't officially abolish the death penalty until 1981. This means the era of the disco, the microchip, and the space shuttle coexisted with a form of capital punishment that felt more at home in the 1790s. The timeline of human progress is jagged. We can build a Death Star in Hollywood while still using a wooden blade to settle the law in Europe. Number 4. Nintendo, the Victorian card shop. We think of Nintendo as the pinnacle of digital entertainment, a company built on silicon chips and pixels. But Nintendo was founded on September 23, 1889. To give you a sense of how old that is, when Nintendo opened its doors in Kyoto, the Eiffel Tower was the brand new controversial centerpiece of the Paris World's Fair. In London, the police were still searching for Jack the Ripper. Fusajiro Yamauchi didn't start the company to make video games. He made Hanafuda cards, hand-painted playing cards often used by the Yakuza for gambling. Nintendo spent nearly 100 years as a card and toy company. They survived the fall of the Qing dynasty, both world wars, and the invention of the television before they ever touched a computer chip. Mario's corporate great-grandfather was a Victorian-era craftsman who probably would have been baffled by the idea of an Italian plumber jumping on mushrooms. Nintendo isn't just a gaming giant, it is a survivor of the 19th century that successfully pivoted into the 21st. Number 5. The Lunar Luggage Gap. Moon boots before wheels. On July 20, 1969, humanity achieved the impossible. We broke the bond of Earth's gravity, calculated a trajectory to a moving celestial body, and landed 2 men on the lunar surface. The Apollo 11 mission used the most complex computers and machinery ever conceived. And yet, when Neil Armstrong got back to Earth and went on his world tour, he had to carry his heavy suitcases by the handle, like a caveman. The wheeled suitcase was not patented until 1970, a full year after the moon landing. Bernard Sadow, a luggage executive, saw a worker at an airport moving a heavy machine on a wheeled pallet and realized, wait, why are we carrying these? Before 1970, if you had a heavy bag, you either carried it or hired a porter. We had the technology to build a Saturn V rocket, but the idea of putting 4 tiny casters on a bag was considered unnecessary by department stores for decades. It is a humbling reminder that we often solve the biggest problems in the universe before we solve the most obvious ones in our daily lives.
Number 6. The Great Emu War, Australia's fluffy defeat. In 1932, the Australian military was sent into the outback to deal with an invading force. This wasn't a foreign army, it was 20,000 emus. The birds were destroying the wheat crops of World War I veterans, and the government decided that machine guns were the answer. They sent Major G.P.W. Meredith and 2 soldiers with Lewis guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. What followed was an absolute comedy of errors. The emus, despite being birds, employed guerrilla tactics. They split into small groups, outran the vehicles, and proved to be surprisingly bulletproof. The major later remarked that if he had a division of men with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, he could face any army in the world. After a month of wasted ammo and international embarrassment, the military withdrew. The emus won. Australia remains one of the few nations to lose a formal military conflict to a flightless bird. Number 7. Cleopatra and the iPhone, the Egyptian perspective. When we think of ancient Egypt, we tend to group everything into one big golden pile. But the timeline of Egypt is so vast that it breaks our sense of history. The Great Pyramid was finished around 2560 BC. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, lived around 30 BC. That is a gap of 2,500 years. For Cleopatra, the pyramids were already ancient, mysterious ruins. She lived closer to the invention of the iPhone, 2,037 years after her death, than she did to the building of the very monuments she is famous for. She wasn't a primitive queen. She lived in a world of high-level Roman politics, libraries, and advanced philosophy. To her, the pyramid builders were a lost, mythic civilization. We are closer to Cleopatra in time and technology than she was to the origins of her own kingdom. Number 8. The Roman mouthwash, The ammonia economy. The Romans were pioneers of law, architecture, and urine. In ancient Rome, urine was so valuable that it was collected from public toilets and taxed by the Emperor Vespasian. Why? Because of ammonia. Romans used aged urine as a laundry detergent to bleach their togas and, most unhingedly, as mouthwash. They believed the ammonia would whiten their teeth and strengthen their gums. And technically, they weren't wrong. Ammonia is a cleaning agent. When Vespasian's son complained about the smell of the tax money, the emperor held up a gold coin and famously said, "Pecunia non olet," money does not stink. This phrase is still used today in economics. So the next time you use a minty fresh whitening strip, remember that for centuries the height of luxury was gargling something much more organic. Number 9. The Pepsi Navy. Soda sovereignty. In 1989, the Soviet Union was collapsing, and they were desperate for Pepsi. But since the Soviet ruble wasn't accepted internationally, they couldn't pay for the syrup in cash. So they traded the only thing they had in abundance, decommissioned military hardware. For a brief window in 1989, PepsiCo became the owners of 17 submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer. This technically gave a soft drink company the 6th largest military fleet in the world. The CEO of Pepsi famously joked to the U.S. National Security Advisor, "We are disarming the Soviet Union faster than you are." Eventually, they sold the fleet for scrap metal, but for a few weeks, a corporation had enough firepower to invade a small country just to protect its sugar supply. Number 10. The Mammoth Pyramids. Ice Age survivors. We are taught that woolly mammoth died out at the end of the Ice Age, long before civilization began. But a small population of mammoths survived on Wrangel Island in the Arctic until about 2000 BC. The Great Pyramid of Giza was finished in 2560 BC. This means that while humans were using massive limestone blocks to build the world's most famous monument, giant hairy elephants were still walking the earth. They weren't prehistoric to the Egyptians, they were contemporaries. If a pharaoh had been adventurous enough to sail far north, he could have theoretically hunted a mammoth. The Stone Age and the Age of Pyramids weren't separate chapters, they were the same book, just happening in different rooms. History isn't a straight line, it's a tangled web. We live in a world where the past never really leaves us, and the future often arrives before we're ready for it. From samurai sending faxes to Pepsi commanding a navy, the truth is always weirder than the script. If these 10 moments didn't break your brain, you might be a time traveler yourself. And don't forget to subscribe for more.